every year. It's usually in the fall semesters, and usually we have people actually visiting campus. But this year, of course, there's been some disruptions if you have been paying attention to the world around you. So we are very happy to be able to welcome Leila Harris from afar, and hopefully we will be able to bring her to campus in the near future. But this lecture series is held every year based on an endowment from Richard Murphy, who was the first chairman of our department in the 1960s and 1970s. And so we are fortunate to be able to bring a set of prominent folks to campus each year. And I will pass it on to Maria Lane now, who has been organizing our colloquia during this academic year, to give some more of an introduction and some thank yous to folks who helped bring this presentation about. Maria.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and welcome, Leila. I just wanted to really just give some thank yous. First of all, to NMSU for our partnership throughout this whole year. We've been sharing our virtual colloquium series, and that's been a really successful partnership. So thanks to all of you for being here, especially my partner, Chris Brown, on that end. I also want to say thanks to my colleague, Liping Yang, and also our grad student, Sari Guy, because they made our new map of the Murphy lecturers over the years, and it's really awesome. If you haven't checked that out, I'll drop the link in the chat. That was just a nice thing for them to do for the 10th anniversary. And then let me also say thanks to our co-sponsors on campus for this event. You can tell the broad interest of Dr. Harris's research by the number of co-sponsors we got to participate here. So that includes Africana Studies, International Studies, Political Science, the Water Resources Program, and the Resilience Institute. So thank you to all of you for participating and being here today. And then finally, I'm just going to say thanks to my co-organizer, Miriam Gayantaki, for helping organize this, specifically the events before where we were able to interact with Dr. Harris in some individual meetings. So, and I'm actually going to turn it over to Miriam to do the formal introduction of Dr. Harris before she begins. And I'll see you at the end because I'm going to moderate the Q&A. All right, Miriam, over to you.
Thank you, Maria. I'm thrilled and honored to present Professor Leila Harris as our speaker for the Geography and Environmental Studies Department Annual Murphy Lecture. Trained as a social, cultural, and political geographer, Professor Harris's work connects political ecology, nature-society studies, and issues of social cultural difference, inequality, and politics. Dr. Harris is a professor at the Institute of Resources, Environment, and Sustainability and the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice. She also serves as co-director for UBC's program on water governance, runs a grad student collaborative called EDGES, Research Collaborative, short for Environment and Development, Gender Equity and Sustainability Perspectives, and is an associate of the Department of Geography and the Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of British Columbia. Not only is her list of affiliations extensive, but so is her academic impact, with over 100 publications and countless of grants and invited presentations. Professor Harris has brought critical perspectives to the study of water politics and conflict in the Middle East and beyond, highlighting key gender, equity, and sustainability concerns regarding water use, access, and governance, particularly with respect to ongoing governance shifts using interdisciplinary methods and approaches. Her work has highlighted the centrality of gender, ethnicity, and social spatial difference for developmental and environmental changes and challenges, participatory resource governance, and practices of environmental citizenship. And today we're very excited to hear about your work in Cape Town and Accra. So now please join me in welcoming Professor Harris. Thank you so much.
Thank you all, and thanks especially to Miriam and Maria and others who helped to organize, and also the co-sponsors. So I'm speaking from with you today from the ancestral, unceded, and occupied territories of the Musqueam, Coast Salish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. So if I were to say to you that Ghana has over 81% access to water, and the United States and Canada 99 to 100%, would you believe me? In fact, if you go to the Joint Monitoring Program website, as I did a week or two ago, you'll see that they're boasting a number of 81% drinking water safely managed in Ghana. Canada and the United States both appear at 99 or 100. But I'm sure some of you are a little doubtful of that figure in terms of how close we are to meeting this goal, SDG 6, of access to water and sanitation for all. And the target date, as you probably know, is 2030. But what did you think of when I asked you that question? Perhaps immediately you thought of Flint, Michigan, and what's been going on there with thousands of children who have been exposed to lead in drinking water, among other health issues. Sorry, there's a way in which, okay, that was blocking my, my ability to advance. Hold on one second. Oh my gosh. Okay, I think it's going to work now. You might have also thought about the issue of small water systems. So if you look at small water systems, people who rely on well or other water, there are in fact millions of people who don't have safe access to water, who have threats of contamination or lack of access, who are not on a larger system. You might have also thought about the nearby Navajo Nation, where 1/3 of people do not have access to plumbing inside the home, or in the situation in Canada, an estimated 1/5 of First Nations on reserve have drinking water advisories at any given time. These are all, of course, in the context of North America, as I've just been citing. And I just wanted to mention this incredible work that's been done by geographers Dietz and Meehan, looking at the situation of what they term plumbing poverty in the US. This is really a comprehensive, rich study that's looked at whether or not people have full access to sanitation, drinking water, and facilities for bathing in the home. And absent any of those three dimensions, they would be considered plumbing poor in this analysis. So what they've done is they've looked at hotspots in terms of plumbing poverty. The numbers on the right, which are small, but it shows you that a number of populations, as you might imagine, are overrepresented with respect to plumbing poverty: Black, Hispanic, American Indian, Alaska Native populations. In fact, they've also found that AIAN households are 3.7 times, and Black households 1.2 times more likely to lack complete plumbing than households that don't have a household head that identify as Black or Alaska Native American Indian. So all of these sort of force us to think about these gaps in infrastructure, issues of lack of access to water, but also, of course, issues of safety and other dimensions that we really might want to attend to if we're looking at water access and inequalities. And those are not dimensions that are addressed generally in the Joint Monitoring Program numbers that I gave you at the front. So the way that I would like to proceed today is by thinking through some of these questions around unequal access to infrastructure and water in particular, and to do so through the extensive work on critical infrastructures, mostly from geographers, but also primarily anthropologists. And a number of names are here. There's actually many, many more names I could list here, but just a small sample of the extensive work on critical infrastructure. And what they invite us to do is to think about the politics and the poetics, using the language of Larkin, about infrastructure. So it's basically taking infrastructure at the center, thinking through these dimensions of infrastructure, but also really going beyond that to think about how this translates to broader issues of politics, meanings for people's daily lives, questions of citizenship, and so forth. And so the specific questions I'd like to consider and think through with respect to water geographies and uneven infrastructure would be to start to ask, what are the implications of uneven infrastructure for people's daily lives? What are the symbolic and material attachments that go with those infrastructural inequalities? So how does this actually translate into different meanings and possibilities and other dimensions, as I'll discuss? And the other question that I'll link with this, building on some recent work on water insecurity, is apart from the implications of water insecurity or lack of access to safe or affordable water for our bodily health, something we know to be very critical and important, how else does this affect well-being at community and individual scales? How does this affect our social and political lives? And I'll end up with some discussions more broadly around democracy and similar questions as well. So what I'm really endeavoring to do here is to sort of think beyond those numbers, beyond the sort of basic access, minimum needs framing of water, which is very prevalent in policy circles. So I want to sort of move away from a strict infrastructural focus, but at the same time, I really would like to center our attention to infrastructure from that sort of critical infrastructure perspective. So if that's unfamiliar to you, I'm hoping by the end, you'll know what I mean through the examples that I'll speak to. So as I said, generally, when we look at some of these numbers, when Ghana states, as they did 5 years in advance of the Millennium Development Goal target, that they had met the goal for water, that they're not often thinking about the quality or affordability or other dimensions. They're just looking at the presence or absence of pipes and the distance to homes and those sorts of metrics. I just want to note that they've also updated how they define improved water. So the earlier definition is here, which includes pipes and boreholes, etc. But now they've gone on to include provision through tanker, sachet water, and other ways that people access water as well. So that actually starts to put into a frame where we can maybe understand how Ghana is at 81% now, because many people do access water through tanker, sachet, and these other means that have now been added to the definition of what qualifies as improved water. Just as a note on the safety question, an interesting analysis done by Mahama and colleagues in Accra has said if they define water safety differently, and in fact foreground safety in their analysis, they look at, instead of the definition of improved water of the type you see here from the WHO, they defined safe water as low likelihood of contamination. And in so doing, they undertook a survey of 1,500 households in 5 neighborhoods of Accra. And they found that in contrast to the 41% at the time that the WHO said had access to improved water sources, their number was closer to 4.4% for that sort of revised definition and notion of safety, instead of just looking at the presence or absence of pipes or taps. So similar to my orientation and wanting to learn from and build on the work of critical infrastructural studies, I'm also really working here with this revised notion of water security that has some relationship to what I was just speaking to. And this has been proposed by Jepson et al. And the basic idea is, instead of looking at water per se as a discrete entity as H2O, if we're looking and interested in water security, we should have a much broader framing, which looks at what are the hydro-social relationships, so hydrological and social, that promote well-being around water. So not does someone have access to water, but how can we think about water security as being those broader relationships that promote well-being? So the idea here again is, yes, we need water for our daily needs, we need it for our bodies, but water also affects our lives in myriad other ways. And how can we think about fostering a more healthful relationship where people are able to rely on safe and affordable water for well-being and a healthy life? So just to shout out before I begin and I move to the empirics and the case study data, here I just wanted to mention the HY's Research Coordination Network, and Wendy has been one of the leaders of this, Wendy Jepson, who I just mentioned. This has been a really exciting network to be a part of, and I actually just wanted to mention it for you all as well, because at a minimum you could join the listserv to be appraised of events that are upcoming, and there are also opportunities to become involved if you're interested in these sorts of questions. So here you could just go to their website and register. So I'll be drawing on the work of the HWISE group, and also just this has been an effort and a collaboration that's really informed my thinking on these questions over the past several years in particular. So let me turn now to the research that we've been undertaking in Accra and Cape Town. And this has been a multi-year, multi-investigator, multi-method project. So it's been about 10 years that we've been working in these sites, mainly through different postdoc and student projects, and also other things that I've led as well. So the broad questions of the research is to look primarily in vulnerable or underserved communities at what are the daily experiences of water access and inequality. How do people narrate those experiences? And what does an understanding of those daily experiences and meanings mean for our efforts to improve the situation of water access and safety, or for the efforts to better engage, more meaningfully engage these communities in water governance? So we've been focused on the lived experiences. We've been aiming to attend to policy dimensions of those questions. So in terms of the methods, we've done many interviews, focus groups in different communities. We've done surveys, 2 different surveys at different time steps in the sites, and also a participatory video project. And the names of all the investigators, many of whom I'll cite below, are listed here. So just to give you a quick orientation, in Accra, these are some of the communities where we've worked. Not all of them are highlighted here. We undertook the 2012 survey, which I'll draw from, in Ashaiman and Teshi, which are 2 communities on the outskirts of the city. All of our sites, both in Accra and Cape Town, were selected to be among the least well served. So again, the most vulnerable. We're not looking for representative or to characterize the overall system. We're looking at the situation for those who we know to be particularly vulnerable with respect to water access and security. So in Cape Town, it's looked a little different. Our survey was undertaken in the townships of Philippi and Kailicha, but all of the qualitative work, including the interviews and focus groups, and also the participatory video work, was in Kailicha only. So let's just move now to start to look at what does the water situation in these communities look like. And again, this is just a glimpse drawing from the 2012 survey, but it starts to give you a portrait, which I'll try to flesh out through the remainder of the talk. So just to look very quickly at these basic questions about ease of access to water, whether the water is of good quality, and whether or not people are satisfied with water in their community. So a couple things you might note. One is that over 90% of our respondents in South Africa said the water is easy to access and of good quality. So that's a little surprising, especially as I noticed we picked the sites where we expected these issues to be most acute and severe. But you'll also notice that there's a drop-off in satisfaction. So having easy access to good quality water does not equate with satisfaction, which ends up being some interesting issues that come up in terms of what's going on that doesn't allow people to feel satisfied with water services. You'll also notice, of course, that there are big differences perhaps between the data from Ghana and South Africa. I could talk more about that if you want in the Q&A in terms of what that means. It's not meant as a direct comparison, and there's many dimensions that are very distinct in the sites. So I don't want it to be seen as a comparison, even though I'm including them on the same slide. So another thing you might notice is that, the largest share of people in Ghana say that they disagree that water is easy to get, but they most still think the water that they do get is of good quality. So it's good quality, but not easy to access. So building on the work of some of the HWISE colleagues, especially Amber Wutich, we asked questions, for instance, about worry. So we asked a number of the emotional dimensions about what does it mean to experience these issues around poor access to water or poor quality water on a daily basis. And again, you'll note that even, again, the situation in South Africa is perhaps not so bad around water. Still 50% say they worry. And then in Ghana, it's a much higher number that worry often, sometimes and occasionally about water on the right there in the darker orange colors and light orange. So let's look a little bit in terms of how people talk about some of these dimensions around water in their community. This was work led by MA student Lucy Rodina, who worked in Kailicha, South Africa. And this is largely based off of interviews and focus groups in those communities, especially in Site C. This is an image from Lucy that shows one of the communal taps. And I'll show you two things of interest in this image. One is just to see what the housing looks like for over half of the people in the community who live in what's called shack housing. And this would be in contrast to an RDP home, which would be a cement home provided by the government, which a proportion of the residents in the community would live in. The RDP home would have an in-home tap and toilet, and then everyone else would be relying on these communal taps as shown here. This one happens to be broken, but my main point is not about disrepair and repair of infrastructure. So here you can see a quote from a resident who's talking about what it's like to access water from these communal taps. So at the bottom here, you see, we're fetching the water from that pipe. Children come and play there. Other people come to do their laundries there. Others come to do dishes. So it's filthy, you know, it's not clean, it's not hygienic, it's bad. So you can start to maybe get a little bit of a sense of how these services, the water is of good quality and easy to access. It's within 200 meters of the home, as the joint monitoring program would want to see, but there are still concerns and here around adequacy and hygiene and other issues. Another interviewee mentioned that issues around payment for services, people in the community should not be treated the same because they're not the same. He himself, a shack dweller, is comparing himself to the residents in the community who are in an RDP home. He says, we are not the same. We do not have the same rights. Some people are staying in good houses, in beautiful houses, which have been built with good conditions, but other people are still staying in the shacks. How can we, the shack dwellers, pay for water? So here he's drawing out some distinctions, which are notable, and others who've worked in South Africa have also noted in terms of how these ideas of relative inequities play out and are narrated by people. So within the community, there's a strong distinction between the situation of water access. As I said, people with an RDP home would have an in-home tap and toilet. So the communal taps and toilets would be shared primarily by the shack dwellers. So here, these ideas of inequality and difference really play out in important ways. And here we also were able to look at the way this mapped onto ideas of responsibility or citizenship differently. So in short, people who have benefited from the RDP homes do feel and express more responsibility to pay for those services, such as the water, but also this idea that other people have commented on around responsible citizenship to use less water and other dimensions as are being requested sometimes by state entities. So moving now to Accra, just to look at a little bit of the work. This was led by MA student Elizabeth Tapa-Koru. And here you can see one of the things she did that was so interesting. She did a follow-on survey, but she selected two different sites with very different infrastructural and demographic and other considerations. So specifically, she looked at Gamashi, which would be an indigenous community near the coast that does have access to pipe water. So even by that initial JMP definition, this would be considered a community with improved access. And she looked at considerations in Medina, which is a newer settlement on the outskirts of the city with a lot of in-migration from other areas of the country and other surrounding countries as well. And Medina is entirely off the pipe network for the greater Accra region. So she compared the experiences of water access and inaccess in both communities, and she did some analysis, which would be more from a resilience frame in terms of how, from an entitlements perspective, how these different communities might be differently situated with respect to water stress or crisis. And what she found is in Gamashi in particular, which is the indigenous community, which is on the pipe network, many people talked a lot about conflict over water. Even if there was a pipe available to them in the compound or the home, they might not use it because of cutoffs or because they would want to avoid conflicts with family members when the bill came due about who would have to pay what. So it was often simpler for them to just purchase water from a vendor on a daily basis so everybody would pay their own and they wouldn't be having those conflicts or difficulties later on when the bill came due. People in Gamashi also talked a lot about waiting in long lines and conflicts that would emerge while they're waiting for water. There were other dimensions as well. And as I said, in short, somewhat counterintuitively, Medina seemed to be a little bit more resilient with respect to water stress. And one of the simple issues that was at play is when the city has less water, there are often cutoffs throughout the city. And in Medina, they have established relationships with the tanker drivers already. And so those would be the first places often served, even in times of stress. And in Gamashi, where people might be relying on local vendors who have access to the pipe through the city network, they might not have access to water at all in times of shortage or cutoff. So there was some interesting counterintuitive results from a sort of more broad entitlements perspective about how these communities were able to navigate these issues of water insecurity, and how, in fact, the pipe, access to the pipe, didn't really promote water security in the way that you might think it would, especially given that the cheapest water available of good quality is actually through the municipal system. So that would usually be considered an advantage. So let's just return to the way that I was trying to frame these issues. So I'm interested, as I said, how can we think about experiences of water insecurity, knowing that they're important for bodily and public health, but also how do they connect to other aspects of experience? So when I talk about that, again, drawing on some of this critical infrastructure work, but also that broadened notion of water security, I'm especially interested in social and political experiences. So experiences of inequity, experiences of engagement in the community, senses of the state. So these are some of the themes I'll speak to now. So in that critical infrastructural body of work, there's a lot of people who discuss especially citizenship. So two examples would be hydraulic citizenship from Anand, or infrastructural citizenship from Sheldon, Lemansky, and others. So here, they're interested in the ways in which people's engagement, sense of belonging is mediated through infrastructure. So as an example, Anand talks quite a lot about pressure. In Mumbai, when people don't have access to water, he documents ethnographically the way that people then go to put pressure on the engineers or the city to allow water to flow to their community. So in part, it's the way that the lack of infrastructure or lack of water security sort of activates them in different ways in terms of their citizenship practices. So just out of interest, having read so many of these perspectives, mostly based on qualitative ethnographic work that are sort of thematically and empirically linking the material issues around water, the infrastructures around water, to citizenship, we decided to test some of these relationships in our data from South Africa and Ghana. And this we could talk a lot about, I'm sure. I'm going to try and do a quick summary version. Basically, we decided there were two main hypotheses that we saw different evidence of in different studies in the literature, and also you can imagine just intuitively as well. One would be a positive relationship between the material water conditions or infrastructures and participation or engagement in the community. So as people report having better quality water or being more satisfied, they might feel more a sense of belonging, they might be more involved in their community. So that would be a reinforcing relationship or a positive relationship here. On the other side, those with maybe lower water access or conditions might be less engaged in the community because of experiences of marginality. And one specific example from the literature on this is work by Jackie Golden in South Africa, where she actually documents that people without access to sanitation end up deciding not even to go to church anymore because they're worried that someone from their church might stop by their home, and then they would have to face the embarrassment of not having access to sanitation. So that shows how the marginalization in terms of lack of access to infrastructure can reinforce marginalization in terms of citizenship and lower community engagement. On the other side, you can imagine a relationship where it's a negative relationship between improvement and services and engagement. So in the Anand example I just gave you of hydraulic citizenship, out of necessity, people don't have the services and they need to be active and engaged in the community to seek those services. So you might see a strong response with people with poor quality water in terms of community engagement. I think the examples from Flint would similarly be on the necessity part of this quadrant in terms of not having a problem and then being very engaged in the community to try and resolve that problem. On the other side, you could see the other side of this equation is as conditions improve, maybe people would be more apathetic or not having to engage in the same way. So just to lay out briefly these two possibilities, which are the exact opposite, so two distinct hypotheses in terms of what we thought we might observe just based, as I said, on other case studies and the sort of conceptual linkages that people had documented, though not always carrying the thread through, just maybe sometimes insinuated these relationships or expressed them in very high levels. So interestingly, I think we found that both were going on and in opposite dimensions, and that this was differentiated by gender and country context. So again, we can talk more if you're interested, but we found that access was predictive in terms of the necessity apathy hypothesis, but this was driven primarily by male Ghanaian respondents in the data. Similarly, we found that South African women were driving a relationship in the data, and this is when we differentiated by gender and also country context that allowed us to see these cross tendencies, that South African women were driving a significant relationship in the data in terms of the quality dimension. So access to water was different from quality of water. Ghanaian men and South African women were each driving those relationships in the data set in different ways. So that's all to say that there's the potential that either or both of these are going on, but likely we can think of different dimensions of the material issue around water, sometimes access, maybe and otherwise quality, but that different communities might be affected differently, and it might be just given their situation. So think about how and why these different levers and drivers might encourage people or affect people in different ways in terms of experiences of marginality and so forth. So just to continue on the citizenship theme for one moment, we also asked if people wish they could participate more in community meetings, community governance. We asked about water governance as well. The simple message here is that in both country contexts, people overwhelmingly responded that they wished they could be engaged more in those decision-making or community fora. Sticking on citizenship for one last slide, this is a graph that shows community protests, otherwise known as the service delivery protest in South Africa over the past decade or more. And you'll see that there's been a trend, an increase in these service delivery protests throughout the country, in Cape Town and elsewhere, and that they've often been highlighting issues of water and sanitation, but also housing, electricity, and other services. So a number of commentators from South Africa in particular have noted that this is also a citizenship practice that we need to attend to. So people's active engagement in protest needs to be recognized as citizenship praxis as well. So sticking on this theme, but on the other side, as I said, I'm sort of interested in societal and state negotiations and relationships around infrastructure and how this gets expressed and how this plays out in different contexts. So this was a theme I was interested in from my earlier work in Turkey, where I worked in the Kurdish areas, and I was surprised at how much people expressed positive sentiments around state involvement in the region around water infrastructure and development. And here what we did is we again looked at the data and tested whether or not there was a relationship between how people expressed quality, access, and satisfaction with services and other dimensions of quality as were collected in the data with trust in government. So was there a relationship? And again, just to sum up without going into all the details, what we found was that there was a relationship, but not in Ghana, it was only in South Africa. And that there was a relationship with quality of water, satisfaction with water, but not with access to water and trust in the government. So I'll speak to this in just a minute in terms of why that might be. So as I said earlier, there's a sort of interesting little puzzle that emerges as why doesn't good quality access to quality, easy access to good quality water equate with satisfaction? And a couple of those little narratives I give you a sense about the difference and the experience of inequality that people express in terms of how they access water in their community. So I mentioned that the shack dwellers maybe talk about how the RDP homes and how that plays out in their lives and affects them in terms of those unequal experiences. As well, of course, people living in Kailicha are very well aware that people in nearby Rondebosch or other white communities experience water very differently. And so these ideas of relative inequity play out on different scales and are very much part of the imaginary in terms of how people express their relationship to these issues. So both the dignity, the hygiene concerns, having to wait in lines around a communal tap, but also these experiences, I think, of relative inequity play very strongly in terms of a smaller number of people being satisfied with the services in South Africa, but also the service delivery protests. So this is enough of an issue, even though 90% people agreed that water was easy and good quality, that people are hitting the streets and protesting about water, sanitation, and other dimensions. So why would it be that we see this relationship in South Africa, but not for Ghana? And maybe for those of you who are aware of the context, it seems intuitive. I think there's some other ways that we might address this, but in my mind, I think what we're basically observing here is the artifact of the strong discourse and policies in South Africa around the human right to water. So South Africa, you might know, is often celebrated as one of the countries with a constitutional guarantee, and it's actively pursued this. So the numbers in around Cape Town would be 96, 97% access to water. And in the townships, Kailicha and otherwise, it's not that much far behind. So most people have access by those basic metrics and definition. But what's missing is when the ANC came to power, they were promising not only that every citizen would have access to water and sanitation, they promised that that access would be equitable and that every citizen would have equal access to those services, and that this would be a prime pathway to redress past inequalities associated with apartheid. So I think this is simply what we're observing in our trust data, where there's this tethered relationship and this expectation, both not just that people should have access to basic water, they don't just need water to live, they would like their water access and other services to be equitable and to be treated as full citizens in the new South Africa. So those meanings and associations become bundled and attached to these sort of politics of infrastructure in the more basic sense. So I think this is why access doesn't appear, but quality and satisfaction are more emphasized in terms of if people think the quality and if they're satisfied with the services to the same extent, then we can see that tracking with trust in government. As stated by anthropologists Redfield and Robbins working in South Africa, the idea of democracy, rights, and citizenship in South Africa have become tightly tethered to popular demands for access to state services, technologies, and infrastructure. And I think that sums up what we're seeing in some of these dimensions of the data that I mentioned to you. So overall, what I'm hoping to emphasize is that when we think about the politics of infrastructure, it would be useful to look at the meanings and everyday realities, not just does a pipe appear, do people in Gamashi or Kailicha have access to a pipe within 20 meters of their home? Perhaps, but how does that actually play out in terms of if people are actually able to engage that to access safe, affordable, and culturally appropriate water, among other dimensions that we should probably think about if we're interested in water security, especially in that broader definition of water security that I introduced from Jepson et al. The other thing that I'm hoping to just foreground is the importance of inequity to some of these questions. So the meanings that we attach to this are not just, are I having enough water to meet my minimum requirements for my body, but how does this play out on a broader stage around relative inequities in the way that I was speaking to very briefly in those examples. Let me give you two more examples around the focus and interest and importance of inequity before I closed. This is work that was led by Margaret Morales, who is an MA student who looked at sanitation infrastructural possibilities in Buenos Aires. And here's a little snippet, a quote from one of her interviews on the bottom. And the picture of the urine diversionary toilet is here. And she was using this and other options to ask residents in Villa La Madrid if what they preferred and what they thought would be a suitable or sustainable solution to the sanitation problem in their community. And here's this one woman who said to her, a woman in her late 60s, "But do you have those in Canada?" "In some areas," she responded. "People use them?" "Some." Then she said, "Where, for example?" So this respondent was highlighting these inequities, not only in Buenos Aires. People in the community did emphasize, if other people in the city have flush toilets, we would like them as well. They didn't want to have to engage with their own feces and excreta through the manual labors that would be required for a technology such as those being proposed by many engineers for their community, such as the urine diversionary toilet. But here she's also highlighting not just relative inequities in the community, but also at the global scale. So global north and south, you're asking me to use that toilet, but is that what you in Canada also use? A similar instance happened in Megan's work in the Shaiman in Accra. Again, Megan was a master's student who led this work. And one of the respondents said to her, the quote on the top here, "I want to live my life like an American. I want the freedom like they have the freedom. America comes something like water. We've been watching the politics on television. We know what's going on. As for you, you don't have to suffer to get it. Am I lying?" So of course, I highlighted in the beginning that there are a number of key inequities in the North American context as well. But these experiences of infrastructure, I'm suggesting, are fundamentally also experiences of inequity at multiple scales. People in Cailicha compare themselves to the RDP home dwellers and also those living in other areas of the city, just as people in Villa La Madrid in Buenos Aires compare themselves to other communities in the city and more generally. So how does this link to broader questions of democracy? I want to sort of propose, I'm not someone who's lived in Flint, I haven't worked on Flint per se, but I'm increasingly just impressed and noticing how much these issues resonate across these contexts in a way that I think is interesting to reflect on. Of course, again, in Flint, it is about the water. It is about the health effects of being exposed to lead contamination, but it's also about equity. It's also about government accountability and transparency and democracy. It's about how the decisions were made to transfer the water to another source. That was not a democratic process. It's about people feeling whether or not their concerns were heard when they raised concerns about the water, and they were told repeatedly by experts in the science community not to worry because the water was safe. So what resonates with me across all these diverse examples, whether it's sanitation in Buenos Aires or the issues we've been studying in Accra and Cape Town, or when I read and learn about the issues in Flint, a lot of these core issues are the same around, are our concerns heard? Do we matter? Whose lives matter? And how do institutions and larger processes account for us in ways that allow us to know that we're citizens on par with others? And again, that was what I was mentioning for Cailicha. So I want to just close by sort of saying that I want us to move beyond the pipes and taps and a basic infrastructure approach that sort of oversimplifies the problems of water security and its meaning for our lives. But I do also want to recenter infrastructures as key to an analysis that tries to connect diverse and uneven infrastructures to struggles for recognition and broader experiences that matter for everyday lives in the spirit of the critical infrastructural studies work. And it's a fairly large and extensive body of work, as I said. I also really want to center and highlight, as I tried with these last few examples, how relative inequities and how experiences of that inequity matter. So it's not just about saying, yes, we're going to give everybody the appropriate number of liters so that they can live till tomorrow. But as long as this continues on a terrain of inequity, we're going to have different concerns and problems. We're going to have protests in South Africa. We're going to have issues of lack of trust in the water services or in the government when we don't feel like people's needs and interests and voices are taken into account. And so the other thing I'll just close on, which I'd love to have a conversation on this as well as you're interested, I'm really interested to push forward with what Iris Marion Young, Barnett, Ben Habib, Fraser, and others have highlighted in terms of the critical aspects of democracy and the challenges that inequities pose for democracy more generally. So how, just as we emphasize voting, transparency, these other things as key to democracy, how can we think about a politics of inequity, pathways of redress, and issues around engagement in a serious way as being foundational to how we think about democratic politics or the future and suitability of democracy more generally. So thanks very much. I'll end there.
Thank you, Leila, for the fascinating talk. That's a lot of research that you squeezed into a single presentation. So I think you've given us a lot to think about. I will moderate questions here. I'm going to ask folks to drop questions into the chat. And while people are thinking and perhaps typing, I'm going to just ask a quick one to start us off. I'm curious, how many different students have you had in the field working on these over the years? You have a lot of student co-authors on all those papers. Could you give us a number?
I think I've supervised 26 students, but the ones on that Ghana, South Africa project, I listed all of them. I think we were 8 or so, and then a couple postdocs as well. But Margaret Morales was not on that project. Obviously, she was a previous master's student who did the sanitation work, and other students who have done highlighted different work.
Awesome. Okay, I'm going to ask Javier Astorga got in the first question. Javier, you want to unmute and just ask that yourself? Question about cultural relativity.
Hi, thank you. My question is around the cultural relativity around the way the people interviewed frame their answers. Since water cultures is quite different in all the places you mentioned, Ghana, South Africa, Turkey, and North America. So how do you handle that? This is my question.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the way we try to handle it, even though I will, especially to the degree that we engage with surveys and other things, we probably do less well on some of those issues. But in general, we're mainly interested in narratives and how people speak to these issues from their own situation and lives. So I think in terms of a broad approach, that's probably the best well suited to allow that to emerge in terms of a stronger understanding about how people relate to their environment, to water and each other, which is often what we're trying to investigate and better understand. But of course, if we're engaging in surveys, which we've also done, we come up with terms and frameworks which don't always apply adequately in every context. So I would never personally do survey work without also doing the qualitative work and the on-site work. And I've presented some quantitative work to you, even though it's actually not my strength and it's not my wheelhouse in terms of my comfort either, because I'm much more interested in the more ethnographic and daily experiences and narrative perspectives. But as we discussed earlier, when we're having informal chats, just the realities of life and situation have made it so that I can't be in the field as much. And so as you saw from the presentation, a lot of the more long-term fieldwork is the students. And so I think I always spend some time in the field, but not as much as one would like to get that more nuanced perspective. So we're doing this more collaborative approach, which has its strengths and weaknesses, as does any.
Yeah, just as a quick feedback, what made me know about that is the category of satisfaction and unsatisfactory aspects. So it's really hard assessing satisfaction in communities that are lower educated, marginalized. So what is satisfactory for them in terms of use of lack of resources as water? So that's it. Thank you.
That's a great point. And let me just respond by saying too, we did an analysis where we expected, again, based on insights from the literature, that we'd see big gender differences from respondents in terms of how they responded to some of those questions. Not much came out as statistically significant, but the reason why we realized is because especially also men and women have different ideas about what is easy, what is satisfactory, what is appropriate. And so it might not show up if you just do a straight statistical analysis, but that doesn't mean that gender is not important, because, you know, women might be expecting to go and fetch water for longer, and those different expectations really inform, of course, how someone would respond to that question. Thanks, Javier.
All right, I'm going to ask this one on behalf of Chris Brown. He said, I'm keen to understand what may be driving the decrease in protests in South Africa in the time period of 2015 to 2017. And Chris, if you want to unmute and follow up on that.
So there was a little dip in the graph, eh? And then didn't it spring back up after 2017, or did it end? It ended at 2017 in that graph.
Yeah, some of the lines went down and some of them kind of plateaued, but previous to that, you could see the inertia building. And I was wondering if there was some sort of crackdown from the authorities on protests, or if things got better all of a sudden, or what?
I would have to actually go and ask some people or study it to have a good answer. But my immediate answer is other people have hypothesized, for instance, that maybe these protests are also linked a little bit with the Zuma considerations in terms of dissatisfaction with the government more generally, in terms of corruption or other things that were happening on the national scale as well. So those are less about infrastructure, which is often municipal. But of course, you know, dissatisfaction with the government on the whole, you know, would be expressed in these ways also. So when did Zuma step down? It was around that time, but maybe a little after, wasn't it 2017, 2018?
Okay, thank you.
That's part of it, but I would have to ask, and maybe someone in the audience has a better hypothesis about what might be going on. And the key idea is that they've been consistent and growing generally over the past decade, and they've also been countrywide, as are the key things that I would say that I'm trying to emphasize.
So our next question is from Miriam Gayantaki. Miriam, do you want to just unmute and ask that? And if other people want to, if you don't want to type your question in the chat, you can also use your little hand raise tool so that you pop up to the top, and then I'll get you in. So Miriam, go ahead.
Yes, sure. Thank you, Leila. That was wonderful. So in hearing you speak about infrastructure, it made me think about how gender and climate change is kind of like materialized. And I think about efficient wood stoves or compost. So I'm thinking about infrastructure. So I'm wanting to ask if you could speak a little bit more about the role of infrastructure in water provision, and maybe not the performativity of it, but how much attention is given to infrastructure versus actual changes in policy, right, that would actually increase equity and democracy. You're muted.
I was going to say it's kind of a difficult question, so we should follow up after some thinking, but there are some really interesting feminist contributions that have looked at, for instance, gender in the green economy, who have looked at some of those considerations in terms of how some of these policies that are very climate change oriented are manifest and actually affect labor practices or different types of, you know, job opportunities or other things that might affect people differently. But in terms of the infrastructures around water provision, there's, not to oversimplify, but there's two main trends, I think, that you see when you look at people focused on the issue and the challenge of safe and affordable water. The predominant thing is just get the infrastructure out there, fund it, you know, build it. Hopefully it will work, it will be maintained, you know, hopefully people can afford the bills or whatever assumptions go into that. And that's been part of why I would suggest that we have an ongoing crisis, is because that's been our orientation for so long, you know, that we just fund building new treatment plants or wastewater facilities or whatever we fund. So it's been overly focused on the infrastructure and not enough in terms of like, what does this actually mean for people's experiences, lives, health, or well-being, especially in a broader perspective of health and well-being. In the gender side, we also assume, this is generally we, the policy community, in documents, we can see this linkage, explicit and implicit, that if we improve the water situation, we'll improve the situation for women and vice versa. There is some empirical reason to believe that, in that we have a lot of data that shows that girls are less likely to go to school, for instance, when there's not proper sanitation facilities, or that when they have to go and continue fetching water for the household, they might be kept from schooling, for instance. So there are some reasons to assume that, but it's also not detailed in a way that to me would be sufficient to sort of understand how are women and men, or how are different community groups or different sub-demographics affected by different types of infrastructure or different types of projects. So I think those are kind of the key questions. And just since you mentioned wood stoves, one of my colleagues here at UBC does look at gender in wood stoves and has a few projects on that in India and elsewhere, where again, that's a huge consideration for women's health and a number of issues around breathing and quality of air and so forth. And so, again, the assumption is often if we provide cleaner or better types of technologies, this will improve the situation of women and health and so forth. But I think we often are missing some of those connection points to really know how is this affecting these people and their health and other things full on down the line.
All right, we have a question from Jamal. Jamal, do you want me to read it, or do you want to?
Yes, please go ahead and read it, because I'm thinking of something else now. So
He's already thinking of the next thing. All right. Is the term critical infrastructure synonymous with the notion of the built environment as a social determinant of health, which in Jamal's mind's eye is linked with structural violence as found in strategic peace building education?
I'm not sure if I would say it's synonymous with social determinant of health. What I'm trying to, the literature is huge and what I'm referring to, but I'm just trying to think about how these infrastructures do connect with other aspects of social lives. So political lives, social lives. So how a different infrastructural configuration separates off members of the community from others, or how the built environment makes it, harder for people to gather and maintain social networks. So I don't know how exactly, since I'm not a public health person, how that connects with some of the specific ideas around social determinant of health, but they're definitely linked, because a lot of these are around what are the social dimensions in terms of the social dimensions of infrastructures is part of what they're trying to get to. And then the structural violence, it is, I think, linked, even though I'm less familiar again with how that's taken up in the peace building education domain as you're speaking to, but the analysis of Flint and other cases, people have relied a lot on ideas of racial capitalism, Laura Polito, Malini Ranganathan, and others, to sort of think about how these situations of inequality or injustice or ill health, are born from these broader structural considerations around financialization. In this case, it was a financial decision to switch the water source without input from the community, and also, frankly, without even the appropriate engineering to back it up, because it wasn't done properly in any sense at all, and probably should have never been done, to be plain. So I don't have a clear answer, Jamal.
no, that's okay. I mean, I'm just looking for discourse on that, because, I like this term critical infrastructure, because in my mind's eye, I can see how it does link with the built environment and those negative social determinants of health, which in my mind's eye also too are linked with sometimes something I call structural violence, because it causes harm to people's lives. And I think that I can make a case for using that term as we discuss the pathologies of power, which are often found in democracy, as you just described with Flint, and racial capitalism. So I'm thinking of a whole new line of discourse now that I can use in my argument. So thank you. I appreciate all of that. Thank you.
All right, let's squeeze in one last question here from Rob Zur. Often oil-rich countries suffer from the paradox of plenty and end up with worse outcomes in terms of public health and overall development. Do you see evidence of those issues in your research in water access?
Yeah, so I'm familiar with those debates and the resource curse and other debates. And often those do emphasize governance failure in terms of how those benefits of the resource abundance are distributed in the context. So that's where it translates into the case of Ghana. So Ghana has a lot of water. It's not considered water poor in terms of the hydrologic or meteorologic or other indicators. But certainly there are governance challenges, and the UN DP back in their 2006 report said, water scarcity is most often not a situation of water scarcity per se. it's usually governance and politics and inequities that are creating those scarcities. So I would say that that does apply there. And the differences are with some of the resource curse and the oil debates and so forth are more around elite capture and corruption and other things, which I know of some evidences. For instance, when the system was privatized in Accra in the early 2000s, there were instances of corruption, but I haven't investigated that, and I'm not wanting to make broader claims around the specific types of governance failure, even though I would say most of our water governance is a situation of water governance failure in most locations.
All right, I think leave it there since we're at our time. I just want to let everybody know that we did record this and we will be uploading it to our website. I will try to remember next week to send a note to everyone on the registration list so that you know where to find that. And let's just say thanks one more time to Leila for being here, for sharing your work, and for being our 10th Murphy lecture speaker. It's been great to have you here.
Thank you very much for having me. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.